Welcome, everyone. It's 5 o'clock, so we're going to get started with our special council meeting for this evening. Yeah, so I'm calling the meeting to order. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest? See none. I'm looking for an adoption of the published agenda for this evening for July the 4th. Moved by Councillor Bowman, supported by Councillor Meady. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. And I'll move right into reports from administration. And I believe that Ms. Jabor will be presenting. So I'll move right over to Ms. Jabor, our Manager of Planning Services, along with Jeff Watson, our Planner for Planning Services.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's actually me who will be presenting today, and Rita is here beside me to answer any other questions that might arise. First of all, I would like to start by thanking two people, Kevin Carter, our Chief Building Official, and Mike Beamer, our Bylaw Enforcement Officer, because basically this was a collaborative effort amongst the three of us. And we had three principal objectives, and of course, we'll be discussing that tonight. And as you know, this is a public meeting to hear any representations by the public concerning this bylaw. And of course, to appraise council as to what exactly we're intending to do with this. And maybe get some direction from council should any matters arise. So I'd like to start with the slide presentation if I can. I'm expecting does Shelley have control of the presentation?
It's actually Cassandra this evening.
Okay. Can we go to the next slide, please? I think one of the basic questions, of course, is why do we regulate signage in the first place? So next slide. It really boils down to community image. Every merchant, of course, every institution wants to make themselves seen, and they want to have the ability for people to find them. At the same time, we try to affect a balance between what their needs are and the overall community image of the town and our streetscapes. Can you go to the next one? Unrestricted signs can have a negative visual impact. This is a sample in Kingsville where signage was basically out of control. And it was at the request of council that administration take action to remove signs that were basically erected without permits and maintained for longer than permitted. And actually from the stretch where this is in downtown Kingsville, all the way to the Leamington border, there are about 23 signs like that, all of which were removed. Next one, please. This is to the extreme. This is a sample example in Windsor. You get a situation where basically a driver going down this section of Tecumseh Road has on average 4 seconds in which to read a sign. So when you have such a plethora of signs there to look at, it really does a disservice for the business itself because it's virtually impossible for people to distinguish one from another. It's just a blip. It's just a jumble of signage. Next one, please. And it's not just limited to urban streets. Sign pollution can also be found in rural areas as well. This is another example in Kingsville where signs like this were removed. Next one. Bylaw 1350 is the current sign bylaw that we have, and it's been in place for 7 years. And it had three purposes. It was to address the concerns that were, where you're trying to find a balance between business needs and community image. We want to recognize industry trends like electronic media signs, of course, which have been a big matter of contention in some places. And of course, this is the first comprehensive bylaw we have for the whole town after amalgamation. Before that, we had 4 sign bylaws for each of the amalgamated municipalities. So we have one comprehensive sign bylaw now. It's been in place for 7 years, as I said. Next slide. So what is the purpose of the new bylaw? Next slide, please. There are 3 principal objectives. We want a bylaw to be more user-friendly. We want a greater clarity to assist with bylaw enforcement. That's a big issue. And of course, we want to address any matters that might have arisen from the application of the bylaw over the last 7 years. The next set of slides basically sort of outlines what we did to try to accomplish that. So objective 1 was to be more user-friendly. And I will say that a little bit later, we showed a couple of text examples showing the differences. So to be more user-friendly, we completely changed the format. So instead of having a sort of descriptive paragraph type of bylaw, we turned it into a chart form. So it's much easier to read. We also cross-reference sections of the bylaw which basically relate to each other, but weren't stated. So you might read one section of the bylaw without realizing there are other regulations that might apply. The other thing that we did was we bolded any words that basically we define, and definitions are very important in terms of clarity and user friendliness, and as far as the courts are concerned. So as you go through the bylaw and you see a bold word, you can cross-reference that to a definition. The other thing we did was we set out in the bylaw situations where a sign might not be permitted, but council has the ability to basically grant site-specific approval of a sign that's not permitted generally, but for reasons that council might accept, might be appropriate for a specific location. So the instructions on how to do that are in the bylaw. And we also have a quick reference guide. Now, I didn't send that to council, but essentially it's this. It's basically a double-sided piece of paper, which basically has almost the entire bylaw on it. So for quick reference by sign providers and by businesses themselves. The next slide. Objective 2 was to have more clarity for the courts. And the new formatting is one way we did it. And in clarifying and adding definitions, basically for greater clarity for interpretation, was also undertaken. An example, for example, we've set limitations on the brightness of electronic media sign. Under the old bylaw, you could have electronic media sign, but there are really no standards as far as luminosity, the sort of the impact a sign might have on other properties as well as people looking at the sign. And we added a schedule to the bylaw, which deals with billboard signage. Billboards aren't permitted as of right. Basically, it's done by site-specific bylaw approved by council. Council has approved 10 billboard locations throughout the rural part of the town. And what we've done is we've added the schedule because at the same time that council looked at billboards, they also approved a set of guidelines for people to look at if they're going to submit an application for a sign bylaw or billboard approval. And that's now been incorporated as a schedule to the bylaw. And then, which is something which should be very basic, we actually state now in each section when a permit is required and when it's not. Number 3. And then, of course, we're looking at various matters that have arisen in the last 7 years. And one of them, of course, was the question that was raised when we were dealing with a ground sign proposed for a local winery. And that's where is the bylaw permitting a illuminated sign and where it is not. Under the current bylaw, we don't have any statements as to when a sign can be illuminated. It's just to simply assume that it can be. So now we've said specifically when it can be and when it can't be. We've also said when sign permits are required. And we've done things like remove the election sign provisions since we now have a new election sign bylaw. And of course, the other example I mentioned, having technical standards for electronic media signs. Next one, please. This is a sample of what a small section of the bylaw as it stands today. It's basically descriptive paragraphs. You want to go to the next one? Compare that with what the new bylaw, how it's set up. As you can see, the first thing it does is it cross-references other sections of the bylaw. Section 2 is definitions. 3 are signs which are not permitted anywhere, like a rooftop sign, for example. 4 are signs that are permitted in public rights of way, and direction as to how you can go to council to ask for permission to do that. And 5 are basically signs that are permitted across the board in all districts. I want to say that when I refer to districts, basically the sign bylaw is based on our zoning bylaw. So you have a set of regulations for commercial districts, one for residential districts, agricultural districts, and so on. So that's what we mean when we refer to district. You'll see that certain words are in bold. Those are defined words. You'll notice PR, for example, on the ground sign, that means permit required. and other sections will say PNR, permit not required. And you'll all see general provisions, which are sort of the norm, and then you'll see special permissions that apply to certain parts of the sign. In this case, in the commercial districts, for example, you can have electronic media sign occupying 50% of the total sign area. So that's an example of how it differs in terms of just better legibility and a little bit more user friendliness. Next slide. As I mentioned, we've introduced standards for electronic media signs. The first two, 1 and 2, can't be a flashing sign. It has to be at least 20 meters from the intersection of 2 streets having signals. They're already in the bylaw, but 3 through 6 are new. And you can see that some of it is based on county standards for the duration of an image. In other words, how long a picture can be on the sign for, or the minimum period of time. Our recommendation is for 180 seconds with a 1-second transition. Number 4 is luminance. In other words, the amount of brightness a sign can produce. And those are based in industry standards. Those aren't the guaranteed numbers yet. We're still working on that. But the idea is to basically establish a standard so that you don't have an overly bright sign. A prime example of that would be the sign on Highway 3, which is unfortunately in Lakeshore. We have no control over that. But I did receive a number of complaints from people saying that it's simply too bright, especially at night. But there's nothing we can do about it simply because it's not in our town. And then, of course, the requirement that there be a light monitor. So basically, there's a programmable monitor which will monitor the brightness of a sign relative to the ambient light around it by day and by night. Next slide, please. One thing I do want to emphasize is that any sign that doesn't meet the bylaw requirements, the applicant is free to apply to council for permission for site-specific approval of a sign that differs from that. The other thing I want to point out is that we didn't really look at the specific regulations. We basically focused on those 3 objectives. So in essence, most of the regulations that are in the bylaw today for sign size, for the types of signs permitted, and so on, those are all still the same. We haven't changed that. Next one. And as I said, council does have the right to grant permission on a site-specific basis by bylaw, to vary a sign for a specific purpose at a specific location. Now, of course, this is the public meeting. So the formal meeting of council will take place on July 18th to actually approve a sign when we actually submit it to council for approval. The other thing that we need is what's called short form wording. This deals with fines, so that our bylaw enforcement officer would have the ability to impose a ticket or a fine on a business or a sign provider when a sign is in violation. And we also changed the bylaw so that the current bylaw refers to basically the obligation is on sign owners. We're also putting the obligation on sign providers. So if you have a sign provider, for example, who continually violates the bylaw, we will have the right to ticket them as well. Once we have the short form wording in place, and that could take as much as 4 months, because it has to be approved by the courts, we would send notice of the approval to the public. There is no appeal of a sign bylaw because it's done under municipal act, so it doesn't have the same provisions that Plenty Act sets out for public appeal. Once council adopts it, it's in place, and that's it. So it's important that basically, if people do want the opportunity to talk, they had the opportunity. We gave notice to through the newspapers and through social media, as well as on our website. So I'm not sure if anybody has registered, but this was the opportunity to do so. That's my submission.
Watson. And I'm going to ask if there are any questions from council members at this point in time. And it's, Counselor Vanderdolen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, the sound quality was a little poor, so I may not have caught when you answered this, but no appeals are permitted? No appeals of what? No appeals of our decisions or no appeals of the bylaw itself?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, no appeals of bylaw. So once it's adopted by council, that's it.
And am I clear that there's no rooftop signs permitted and no pole signs?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, rooftop signs are prohibited unless, of course, somebody went for site-specific approval with council. Pole signs are permitted.
I'm sorry, are or aren't?
Pole signs are permitted. In commercial districts, a pole sign varies, the size of a pole sign varies with the frontage. So the greater the frontage, the larger a pole sign that's permitted. In institutional districts, a pole sign is also permitted, but they're restricted to one size only.
Thank you very much.
Vanderdolen. Any further questions? Counselor Guerin.
Through you to Mr. Watson. Sandwich signs, they put out in front of restaurants or businesses just to display specials throughout the day. Are we typically permitting them to encroach on the sidewalks? And are they, I seen you had a sample of one in one of the pictures. Are they required to have a permit, a sandwich sign, like an A-frame sign?
Through Mr. Mayor, when we drafted the first bylaw back in 2015, we worked very closely with the Essex Center BIA. And there are a couple of kinds of signs that they were most interested in. One of them was projecting signs, the ones that come out from the wall of a building. And the other one were signs like sidewalk signs. The bylaw allows both, and for a sidewalk sign, there's a size limit of 1 square meter. And they can be placed in the public right of way, but they have to be a minimum distance from any obstruction, like a utility pole or a bench, or some such thing to allow a pedestrian movement. And that's to meet the AOAD standards for disability issues, that sort of thing. So we comply with provincial regulations, and at the same time, we allow that flexibility as far as the use of public right of way.
Thank you, through you. Okay, now on the portable signs, they are permitted, I understand, only certain times of the year and so many applications a year. Is that correct? Can you explain the portable sign a little bit more?
Here, Mr. Mayor, a portable sign, if you're, a sign like the kind that you see with the iridescent letters on it, for example, they're allowed per business for a max of 120 days per calendar year. And we have a permit system whereby we hand out permits on a 30-day, 60, 90, or 120-day basis. So, for example, I could have 4 30-day sign permits in a calendar year per business, and or any combination that totals 120. But the sum total of all permits, whether it's 1 or 4, has to equal 120, and that's the maximum number of days per calendar year.
Okay, so nobody can have a portable sign then basically greater than 120 days in a calendar year. But they could pull them out 30 days and then back to back 30 days if they wish. And then the other question I had on that was, the portable signs, can they be illuminated, or are they only to be non-illuminated? And also on the portable signs, if they want to exceed the 120 days in a year, could they, if they have sign face space left, say on their pylon or on their building, put that readable message sign on one or the other to still do the same type of thing that the portable sign would have done at the roadside, but instead it'd be on their pylon sign? I'm talking specifically to a pizza place that's on our main street in Essex that's recently been going through this same type of an issue with, he wants to have a portable sign. He wants it all year round. He can't have it all year round. So he tried to go around it by putting a reader board on his pylon sign, but understand that the 50% allowance for that extra sign, he's over now. So I'm just trying to get some clarification on those portable signs. Can they be illuminated? Can they affix them to a wall or to a pylon sign if they have sign face area left still?
They can't be illuminated, number one. Number two, under the bylaw for commercial and institutional districts and manufacturing districts for that matter, you can have a certain percentage of your wall sign or pole sign or your ground sign to have changeable copy or electronic media. Okay, so that's the first thing. The portable signs are really special event signs. They're designed for, they're not designed for general advertising under the bylaw. They're intended to basically be, if I had a sidewalk sale and I wanted to advertise the sidewalk sale, that was really intent. As far as the what can go on a ground sign, or as I say on a pole sign, that can be for general advertising or any other purpose. So that's probably the most flexible way of doing it. And of course that can be permanent. You don't have to basically remove anything from a changeable copy sign on a pole or on a ground sign, because they're deemed to be permanent signs. But a portable sign, as I say, has the 120-day limit. And there's really no way around that unless they've got special permission from council to keep it for longer than that.
And through the mayor, one last thing on electronic media signs. They do have the capabilities of doing the flashing, and they do have the capabilities of scrolling and doing all the different things that we're saying we don't want flashing signs to do. How are we to permit the electronic media sign and then still be able to enforce it? I'm not sure how we're going to do that.
Mr. Mayor, a flashing sign is distinctly prohibited. Okay, but in terms of what they do with the sign, this is where the issue comes in. You have what's called the sign frame, which is basically the picture on display, and it varies from municipality to municipality. Some municipalities have a 10-second minimum. In other words, you can't display it. The image must be displayed for at least 10 seconds. The county has a 180-second minimum, and we're actually recommending that. And then they also require that the transition from one picture to another be no more than 1 second. So the bouncing and the flashing and that sort of thing is discouraged. Now, from an enforcement point of view, what you would do is you would videotape the sign activity over, like say, over a 5-minute period or whatever, to get an idea of what's exactly happening and time that relative to what the bylaw requires.
Thank you, Councillor Guerin. Any further questions from council members? Mr. Watson, so I do have a question. So portable signs that are on wagons or wheels, there are a few that throughout the town that have been around for, I would suggest, more than 120 days, perhaps years. Are they grandfathered, or does this come into effect for every portable sign that's in the community?
Technically, they're not grandfathered. They basically fall under the same 120-day limitation. Now, we have situations where for small signs, for example, Explore the Shore, the Essex Center BIA, the Harrow Chamber of Commerce, the Transportation Museum have all gotten permission from council to have the small push in the ground type signs for their special events. And the same thing could be done for other businesses who basically are successful to convince council it's a good idea. So, but otherwise they're bound by that 120-day limit.
That's what I'm talking about, portable signs in commercial districts, not the push in the ground.
Yeah, the large portable signs have a 120-day restriction, and they have to be permitted.
So is it complaint driven whether they're allowed to keep them or not? Because there's some of these that have been around for years. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, basically, I mean, technically we would be citing them in violation of the 120-day limit. And they have a choice then to come to council and ask for permission to have a sign for a more extended period of time. Of course, there are always difficulties in that in terms of setting precedents. So there would have to be a pretty good reason to keep it, but that would be entirely council's judgment. The bylaw doesn't prohibit you from coming to council for dispensation. And that's really a key component of it, because there will be situations where maybe their circumstances make it worthwhile. But that's council's call.
We need to ask the bylaw department on, I guess, the question that I'm asking, not the person who's making up the bylaw. It's enforcement, right? Okay, and Mr. Carter, I might ask you then, since you're here. Portable signs that have been around for a number of years. How do we handle those? Is that complaint driven?
Yes, through your worship, it's complaint driven, but I want to focus on our pre-existing sign bylaw that was incorporated in 2015. A bylaw is only as good as the enforcement. For us to enforce it, we have to have tools. The tools are us being able to write tickets. We, to this current day, do not have approved short wording to write a ticket. Jeff was kind enough to draft up some short wording as a proposal to this new bylaw. But going back to your general question, if the sign is 0.4 meters or smaller, basically is 4.3 square feet, or rather 2 by 2, you don't even require a permit. If it's greater than that, then yes, you'll need a permit. So the existing ones that are out there, complaint driven, we're aware of them. Unfortunately, our hands are tied because we don't have the tool set to enforce it at this time. This bylaw will be enforceable, as we are going to push for the approved short wording, and hopefully clarify a lot of that signage that is out there presently.
Some of the what I don't see in a lot of this is talking about zonings. So there's urban and there's rural, and then there's commercial rural, I guess. So how is the interpretation of what is allowed where? Is that spelled out in here clearly enough?
The bylaw, as I say, is based on zoning districts, but it's blanket. You have a commercial district and a set of regulations. You'll have agricultural districts, set of regulations. So basically, the regulations are tied to the districts themselves. It doesn't make it distinguish from one form of commercial or another, though. The bylaw is still pretty general that way. But for example, the wineries, which are commercial activities in agricultural zones, they have agricultural zoning. So they would be bound by the agricultural regulations of the sign bylaw. Remember the issue of electronic media signage in agricultural zones. That's still not permitted under the new draft bylaw. So the status quo remains in that respect. But if there's a commercial zone in a rural area, it would be bound by the commercial zoning. It just isn't very much of that in our agricultural areas.
Any further questions? Councillor Van der Dolen?
For you, I foresee a potential conflict in the Schedule A, where is it? D, item D, where billboard signs must have a maximum separation of 1 kilometer from the existing billboard sign. Is that an existing billboard within the town of Essex? Or does that include billboards that are on our border roads like Walker and Arner, where there may be a road on the billboard on the Amherstburg side, and there are certainly many billboards on the Kingsville side? Do those take precedent over billboards on our side, and we have to stay a kilometer away from all of those? Thanks.
These standards were established when bylaw 1350 was drafted, because, as I mentioned, billboards are not permitted as of right in the sign bylaw today or in the draft. The deal was that people were obliged to come to council for permission to erect a billboard. And so these standards were set by council at that time. it doesn't distinguish where the billboard is in terms of what jurisdiction. So it would be a physical separation of 1 kilometer, regardless of where the existing billboard is, unless council sees different in the guidelines.
Well, I appreciate the answer. I could see that people would now seek to get billboards in our neighboring towns to get around our bylaw, but I guess that's the way it is. Thanks.
Councillor Guerin?
Another form of signage or marketing displays that's often used with businesses, I'm not sure where they fall under the bylaw or if they're even allowed. So I'm talking specifically to any air forced or wind driven displays. Oftentimes you'll see a business anniversary and a gorilla go up, happy anniversary, or you'll see the squiggly guy whose arms go up and down, and depending on the wind, they move around, all meant to attract the eye, all meant to attract something to the business. I'm wondering if those type of marketing displays or signages are permitted, and if so, what it falls under. Also, the flag and teardrop type signs where you see them out in front of oil change places. Sometimes you'll see them on their roofs. Where do those fall? And the other one you see sometimes is just other people doing third-party advertising, parking a vehicle with a brand on it on someone else's property. I know they're not permitted, but if you had a sign like that, you want on a truck, and you wanted to use it as a means of putting your message out there, could you park it in your parking lot and do that? So a few questions there, but
The oddball signs, the fluttering ones are called feather signs in the industry. And of course, the fluttering inflatable person or thing, none of those are really recognized in the sign bylaw. So, you know, and the bylaw states unless they're stated as a permitted sign, they're not permitted. So that's the first thing. The bylaw also, though, you know, there are some things that are like, for example, if for a birthday party sign and things like that, the bylaw forgives them. Okay, so if you had 24 pink flamingos on your lawn to celebrate somebody's birthday, that's simply ignored. However, there's a time limit on them, so a 3-day time limit. So they can't sort of keep them on there forever. As far as a truck is concerned, like the signage on a truck, that's specifically not permitted in the sign bylaw. So we'd have to demonstrate basically that the truck is there for the purpose of a sign, as opposed to simply being parked there because of the owner of the truck happens to live there. So if a truck is parked on another piece of property, you know, for example, like a truck parked on a farm lot, for example, that is specifically not permitted in the bylaw.
All set, thank you. Mr. Watson, is there somewhere in the bylaw that it's mentioned that there's forgiveness for those pink flamingos and so on?
No, it's basically it's a 3-day limit. So when people have crazy signs like that, they're allowed them for 3 days and that's it. So if we saw a pink flamingos on there for a month's time, then we would probably advise them to remove it. The big issue always is, you know, there are signs for charitable purposes. There are signs for, you know, for a single event celebration, things like that, where it's really a question of just forgiveness. Okay, so rather than try to distinguish every kind, we simply set a limit on the number of days that can be there.
My point is that we know that, you know that as the builder of the bylaw, but when someone goes on to the website and looks at the sign bylaw and they're wondering, where am I at with these squiggly signs? How long am I allowed to permitted to have these up? There's nothing that tells them, and then all of a sudden it creates questions and then they're calling in. If we had something that specifically addresses that written right into the bylaw, then it avoids any confusion.
Okay. Yeah, we can add that.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Verbeek?
Sure, thanks. Through you, Mr. Mayor. I won't be here for the next meeting. I've read through this a couple of times and I'm grateful that you and your team, Mr. Watson, have put this document together. I kind of would, I would support it the way it is. But some counselors here might not be ready to do that. Would you like emails during the next 2 weeks prior to the meeting if there's serious issues in the way this is presented that they'd like, or that we would like addressed prior to, coming before us next week or in 2 weeks so it can be passed?
That's always appreciated. And of course, any questions we get, we'll respond to council. Paul.
Well, thank you for your work on this.
Any further questions for Mr. Watson or Mr. Bohr? If none, I'm going to thank Mr. Watson and Mr. Bohr and the planning team for bringing this forward. And at this point in time, we know that this is, I'm going to ask for that the presentation entitled "A New Sign Bylaw for the Town of Essex," presented by Ms. Rita Jabor and by Mr. Jeff Watson, be received. Moved by Councillor Bowman and supported by Councillor Mady. Any questions? All in favor? Carried unanimously. Thank you for presenting this evening and have a great evening. With that said, then I will ask for adjournment of the meeting. Moved by Councillor Mady, supported by Deputy Mayor Bjorkman. All in favor? That's carried. Thank you. And we'll resume again at 6 p.m.